next week, not this week.
That's all right. We may have another show next week for you to interview. But I'll let Eileen know.
All right, go, brother. All right, go.
And this is the Wisdom Table coming to you from Harlem, USA.
Go.
Based at the Grant House's residence in Harlem, USA. This is the Wisdom Table coming to you from the Grant House's residence, 125th Street in Harlem, USA. I'm Brother Leroy, thankful to the Most High for blessing us with the opportunity to be with you and to be with us. The program, the Wisdom Table, does not reflect the views, attitudes, whimsies, or any other proclivities of the Resident Association. Neither does the views expressed here reflect anything on the housing management at Grant Houses in Harlem, USA. However, the program does reflect the research done by the participants in the program, live and living in studio and by Zoom. We have with us one of our favorite interviewers and interviewees, and he is a young man who has done extensive investigative journalism, and without him, we wouldn't have insights into Venezuela, into parts of Africa, and another book which is relating to the 2020 election, when Trump stole the 2020 election. Thank you for joining us.
Glad to be with you, Brother Leroy. And I should say,
thank you for joining us.
I have a new book out, How Trump Stole 2020. And yes, I know that we haven't had the election yet, but they've already stolen it. But don't worry, we can steal it back. That is, we can bust the burglary. But right now, you've got a very, very serious problem of the elimination of millions of voters of color from the voter rolls. This is no joke. You've got basically a whole Jim Crow operation occurring throughout the United States in swing states. Wisconsin, I was in Georgia, I was in Wisconsin, I was in Michigan, North Carolina, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama. Let me tell you, they are wiping out voters of color by the hundreds of thousands. 1/3 voters wiped out of the Georgia voter rolls. That's how, by the way, in my book, I have a special interview with Stacey Abrams. And she said that's how she's not governor of Georgia, not because she wasn't elected. Stacey Abrams, the first Black woman to ever run for a governorship of a state. And the answer is that Jim Crow tactics used by the GOP governor, Republican governor, Brian Kemp, eliminated 250,000 voters, mostly voters of color, including, by the way, I was at the Georgia voting station, you'll see in the book. I was in Atlanta with 92-year-old Christine Jordan. She is Martin Luther King's cousin. I was there when they threw Martin Luther King's 92-year-old cousin out of the polling station, saying that that her registration had been disqualified. It's just unbelievable. And by the way, the reason that they gave is that she moved. She's in the same house where Martin Luther King was for dinner. After Sunday sermons at the Ebenezer Baptist Church, and they threw her out. If they can throw out Martin Luther King's cousin, who's been voting the same place for 50 years, they can throw you out. And believe me, and they're doing it. 17 million, I kid you not, 17 million people have been removed from the voter rolls in the last 2 years. That's the official government figure from the U.S. Elections Assistance Commission. It's in my book. This Jim Crow operation has stolen the election, but we can get it back. And by the way, anyone listening to this, please check your registration and re-register if you're missing. I checked my registration and it said Greg Palast, no such voter. So I'm telling you, if Greg Palast can be eliminated and Martin Luther King's cousin can be eliminated, you can be eliminated.
Okay, Greg. In terms of Georgia and Stacey Abrams,
yes,
he was not the governor at that time. He was the state secretary. Is that correct?
He was the Secretary of State. So here's the guy. Yeah. Okay. This guy, Brian Kemp, he says, that's the guy with the pickup truck where He says, I got me a pickup truck so I can round up illegal aliens myself. By the way, he fakes that Southern good old boy accent. That's not how he actually talks. But he was Secretary of State, so he's in charge of the voter rolls. He's in charge of where you vote, how you vote, whose votes get counted, and who gets to vote. And even the Wall Street Journal said it was unethical that he was in charge of the voter rolls while he's running. He wiped out 1/3 of voters, especially voters of color and young people. And so then he squeaks by Stacey Abrams to win the governorship by this just raw Jim Crow tactics. But if it were just Georgia, it would be bad enough. But Brother Leroy, the whole point of how Trump stole 2020 is that it's Ohio, it's Michigan, it's Virginia, it's Alabama, and let's not forget beyond the presidential race, we have people like Doug Jones running for re-election in Alabama, and they're doing everything that they can to block black voters from keeping Doug Jones in office. It's raw. It's raw.
Okay. The question, and this it really is a question. Make a statement for you to respond to. Statement question. This focuses on Trump and that machine getting behind him. However, when young Bush ran against Gore and the other gentleman, those were elections that were stolen in Florida. So we're talking about a machine. Go back to that and do it in terms of my view, my thinking. Trump is really, in terms of the Republican Party, is really us be there, according to what some folks say have been the other Bush, Jeb Bush, I think, was set up to be, but he was massacred in the debates. Your comment, going back in time, tracing this machine that has eliminated.
Right. Okay, you can't understand the theft that's going on now, the Jim Crow operation against voters of color, unless you understand what happened in 2000. Back in 2000, by the way, I was a reporter for The Guardian in England. And what I discovered, I got my hands on a list from the governor's office, Jeb Bush, his brother's running for president, and Bush's campaign chairwoman, she's doing a Brian Kemp. She's Secretary of State. Her name was Katherine Harris. Katherine Harris was Secretary of State of Florida while she's running the Bush for president campaign. His brother is the governor, and they remove, are you ready, 94,000 people from the voter rolls, almost all African Americans. And by the way, when I say African Americans who removed from the voter rolls, I'm not guessing, Brother Leroy. It says BLA next to their names for black. By the way, I didn't understand why the BLAs. I kept looking at this list that I got a hold of, and it just said blah, 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 blah. And I said, what's blah, blah, blah? Well, it's black, 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 right? So they are targeting African Americans. In that case, they said that black people, all these tens of thousands of black folk, were ex-cons, had felony records, and therefore couldn't vote in Florida. At the time, Florida was one of the last states where you couldn't vote if you had a felony record. Well, I went through the list, and the only crime of anyone on the list, 0 illegal voters, their only crime was voting while black. They got away with it, and instead of being ashamed and pulling back when I exposed them, they just went on a rampage to bring this system of removing black people from voter rolls across the country, and not just so-called felon purges of people who aren't felons. And by the way, if you're listening to this, like if you're in New York, if you're listening, obviously most of your listeners in New York, if you're listening in New York, you can vote if you have a record, as long as you've served your sentence. Completely, including supervision, you can vote. And by the way, some people think they can't. You can't. But they moved on to other things, which I have in How Trump Stole 2020. I'm going to hold it up again so you can see. By the way, this you can order it now, but it won't arrive for the actual launch is on June 14th. So that you'll have to wait a little bit to get it. But you can order it now. I encourage that. And the thing is that I uncovered other stuff. I was working with Rolling Stone, for example, in 2016, when I uncovered a system called CrossCheck, which was created, as you'll see in the book, by a guy named Chris Kobach of Kansas. You can't remember that name, just think KKK, Chris Kobach of Kansas. And he came up with a system of removing 1.1 million voters, overwhelmingly voters of color, from the voter rolls. Now, why? How could they do this? Well, they said people are voting registered in 2 different states, and therefore they can't, they're cheating. By the way, no one's been arrested for voting twice, but they accused millions of people of voting twice. They couldn't arrest or convict one. It was a joke, but they did remove 1.1 million people. Now, who is voting twice? Well, I have a chapter in the book called 358 James Browns. 358 guys named James Brown lost their vote in Georgia because they said, well, they were registered in another state and voting in another state. Because believe it or not, Brother Leroy, they found a guy named James Brown in Detroit. They found a guy named James Brown in Phoenix, a guy named James Brown in Baltimore. And they said, oh, it's all the same guy. Now, you might say that's insane, but let me tell you, Brother Leroy, that's the trick that they were using. That's the trick. And they removed enough voters in Michigan and Wisconsin and other states to fix the 2016 election. Trump wasn't elected. It was only through this racist trickery. And then beyond this game of CrossCheck, there's been other games that's how they're going to stake 2020. That's the problem that we're running into, is that they've removed all these voters. We have to put the voters back, and we have to be prepared for the other tricks. And by the way, here's the big danger, Brother Leroy. Everyone's moving to mail-in voting. If you've been scrubbed, purged, removed from the voter rolls, there is no way that you're going to get your mail-in ballot. They're going to keep millions of ballots away from voters of color this year. That's how they're going to win. They're not going to send you your mail-in ballot. When you don't get it, if you don't get your mail-in ballot, you can't mail it in. So mail-in ballots are really dangerous stuff that we're going to have to be prepared to fight for that ballot. It's not going to be like that.
Hey, Greg, this is Doug, the producer. So when they don't have, if they scrub you off the thing, would you have to go and re-register?
Yes.
Or how would you know that you're being scrubbed? I guess it's more appropriate.
Well, they say that they send you a postcard, but it looks like junk mail. 96% of people don't even notice it. It's a joke, okay? So that's your so-called notice. The only way to really know if you've been removed from the voter rolls is to look yourself up. Every single state, including New York State, allows you to go on the site of the Secretary of State, look up your name, and if you've now been removed, re-register right there online. You can do that in New York. You can do that in just about every state. Just register right online. 17 million people have lost their votes, especially voters of color, especially young people. If you're a renter and if you've moved, by the way. I know the law says if you've moved in your neighborhood, you don't have to re-register, but you're out of your mind if you don't re-register, because you'll never get your mail-in ballot and you'll probably end up getting scrubbed off the voter rolls. So don't take a chance. If you've moved, I had a woman in Georgia, an African-American woman, who lost her vote because she moved within her building. So she didn't get all the voting notices, so they scrubbed her from the voter rolls. And look, who are renters? Lower income people, urban people. In other words, voters of color, and their vote is usually the color blue, right? So they know exactly what they're doing. They know exactly what they're doing to voters of color. And we can bust it. We can expose it, and especially check your own registration. And if you've got relatives in Wisconsin or Michigan or something, tell them, my God, please check your registration. They've been wiping out people by the hundreds of thousands in each state. So please check your voter registration.
So now, hold on, Brother Leroy's back. But Greg, now, what date did you say your book was coming? I think you said June. You mean July, right?
July 14. Okay,
July 14. Okay.
If I said June, I'm wrong. It's
July. Just want to clear that up.
July 14. So in 2 weeks it'll be out. But if you can order it now from the usual suspects like Amazon,
and
local bookstore especially.
Yeah. And when someone when someone wants to look up their whether or not they're registered or not, they go to where?
They go to two places. You either go to your Secretary of State,
Okay,
the New York Secretary of State, if you're in New York, or you can go to gregpalast.com where we have a lot of it says purge lists. Look up,
Oh,
pull down and at gregpalast.com, your state, and see if I have your purge list. I do have Georgia and Nevada and Illinois and a few other, in
so
Indiana, a few other states.
when you say purge list, what does that mean?
That
You
means
have the list of the people who are not.
they've said you don't get to vote. So I have been suing these states. I sued Brian Kemp successfully in federal,
Oh,
and we got his list, and we got other states began turning over their list of voters that they had removed or about to remove to our lawyers. And I've published these things at gregpalast.com. But if you're in New York, just go straight to the New York State Attorney General. Otherwise, go to gregpalast.com. And of course, there's more information. In fact, at the back of the book, probably the most important thing I've got in the book, besides the exposure of how they're wiping out voters of color, is what I call the ballot condom, how to vote safely. You know, so it's 7, how to protect your vote. It says use Greg and Ted's ballot condom. The reason we said, by the way, Greg and Ted, because I have in the middle of how Trump stole 2020, we've got a comic book by the great Ted.
oh,
I love comic books, so I put it in
covered reading as well, huh?
Yeah, so I have a 48-page comic book in there, which is a lot of fun. But the other thing is this listing of things you can do to protect your vote, including, by the way, you know, if you have cousins, et cetera, in states like Wisconsin, Minnesota, they have to have a witness to mail in their ballot. They may not know that. In Alabama, you need a notary for your mail-in ballot. In some states, like Wisconsin and others, if you're you have to mail in your photo voter ID. You have to, or mail a photocopy of it. And crazy stuff that make it, that just more impediments that make it difficult to vote by mail, to vote at all, of course, but to vote by mail. They're doing everything they can to block you.
Leroy, I'm glad you're back, man.
Greg, tell the story about the Asians who had registered folks to vote. I believe that story is in your book.
Yeah. So if you look at how Trump stole 2020, I have a chapter called Voting Gangnam Style.
You're tuned in to GHCR.NYC, Grant Houses Community Radio, home of the Community News Service and the soul of the Upper West Side.
So I have this story, Voting Gangnam Style. In Georgia, again, you had a group of Asian Americans who are called 10,000 Koreans Vote. And so for 10,000 Koreans to vote, you need 10,000 Koreans to register. So Korean Americans, of course. And so this group of Asian Americans went out and registered 4,000 Korean Americans and sent them to, again, our friend Brian Kemp, who is Secretary of State. And guess what? Their names were never entered onto the voter rolls. So they called up and said, the Asian American leaders called up Kemp and said, what happened to our voters? We sent you 4,000 registrations. They're not on the voter rolls. And his office said, we never got them. There's no such registrations. You're just dreaming this. They said, we're not dreaming. We've made photocopies of these registrations. So we know that we've sent them to you and we've got copies. And they said, you made copies? They said, yeah. So then, you know, within hours, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, their local FBI, kicked in the doors of the Asian American group, grabbed their computers, grabbed their materials, and then threatened to arrest and charge the Asian American vote registrars with felony crimes of vote tampering. What? What do they do besides register Asian Americans? The answer is they claim, well, if you photocopied someone's registration, that's a felony crime. And they said, but if we don't copy these names, how do we know if you're cheating them out of their registrations? And the answer is that's the whole point. They don't want you to have evidence that they've stolen these registrations. Anyway, they dropped the charges, but in the meantime, that was the end of the organization, 10,000 Koreans Vote. The the drive is pretty much defunct. And once again, attacking Asian American voters who vote almost as Democratic as African Americans. They vote 75% Asian American community Democratic these days. And so they know what they're doing. They know what they're doing.
Greg,
yeah.
Greg, what has been the response of any Democrat public politician to the announcement of your book and what it exposes? What has been anybody's reaction?
Well, I've had a lot of reaction, but I'm going to have to divide this into pale faces and politicians of color. Because, for example, Stacey Abrams, who, actually hired my team. You'll see this in the book. She was so excited by our information that she literally hired my team to go through the current Georgia voter rolls and identify people that they've wrongly removed again. And again, it's more than 1/3 people that we've identified name by name have been wrongly removed. But that's Stacey Abrams, the first African-American woman to ever run for governor. What about the white Congressional Caucus? Pretty much silent. I will say, to his credit, Bernie Sanders met with me and the Reverend Jesse Jackson to discuss this stuff. So he's concerned, but of course he's not the nominee. I have gotten from the mainstream Democratic Party pretty much a lot of silence. It's not universal on that is the white Congressional Caucus, and it's just unfortunate that the right to vote has been seen as a racial issue. It's racial victims, but it's not a racial issue. Because if an African American, like for example, this Gulf War veteran named Willie Steen, he was accused of being a felon. He never even got a traffic ticket. He lost his vote. When he loses his vote, I lose my president. Florida was stolen by the Bushes. So it's everyone's problem, but unfortunately, we don't have a lot of white politicians saying we have to protect these votes. Brother, I think we have a little streaming problem.
What about the Black Caucus? What membership has responded to your book?
Well, quite a bit. I've gotten excellent reaction from. Yes, we've got an excellent
announcement. Announcement is out there.
I'm losing you. Sorry.
I'm sorry. Repeat that.
I was losing you, but I should say that yes, we've got great help from the Congressional Black Caucus in getting out the word. In fact, Alcee Hastings, who's the dean of the Congressional Black Caucus, took my article on removing voters of color from Rolling Stone magazine, which is the basis of this book. And he took my Rolling Stone article. He walked over the bridge, the Potomac River, to personally hand my article to Loretta Lynch, who was the Attorney General under Obama, put it in her hands. He says, look, I want to make sure I'm not mailing this to you because I walked across the river on a bridge, of course. He walked across the river to hand it to her, put it in her hand. So you want to say, I don't want you to say you never got this article by Greg Palast. I want you to read it right now and take action. I can't say a lot of action was taken, but I want you to know that we defeated that one method of removing voters of color called CrossCheck. That's pretty much defunct now because we exposed it. And a lot of that was through the Congressional Black Caucus, raising hell. I think I've lost you. I think we've lost you. So I'm going to say goodbye. There's the book. But I'm going to say goodbye to Brother Leroy and thank him for this amazing work that he does in getting the word out to the community about protecting your vote. Oh, there you go.
To respond.
I'm losing you completely. I can't hear you.
All right. Thank you very much, Greg. God bless you and your family.
Thank you. We'll try it again when the virus isn't eating our
All right,
line.
Greg, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you. Bye.
Okay.
Is
All right,
that Leroy?
ladies and gentlemen, that has been
Go ahead.
kind of interrupted interview with Brother Greg Palast, and the book is an important book. It's not fiction, it's fact, and it's up to you and I to check it out and make sure we operate based on the knowledge we got from it. One announcement as we tune off, and that is Minister Louis Farrakhan is speaking Saturday, July 4th. That is going to be announced over NOI.org, the website of the Nation of Islam, NOI.org. Look at presentation NOI.org, but get the particulars and the specs before this Saturday. Thank you very much. God bless you and your family.
Thank you, Brother Leroy.